Okay, good morning, everybody. I really like the intro by Eric because I do think the mindset is the biggest challenge, not just the tools. But since I'm pretty tool obsessed, we came up with a tool to work on the mindset. But before we get started, I think we should really give the conference team and Eric a huge applause because getting so many great people who are trying to bring change to the world, trying to change the way we work, that's really awesome. Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm going to talk about how to intentionally design a lean startup culture, but I just want to see who of you uses some of these tools like the business model canvas or value proposition canvas. Wow, okay. So maybe you should come on stage, talk instead of me. But one of the things we've discovered while doing this, working on tools, was that a big issue, in particular in large companies, but you'll be able to use it in startups and small companies as well, is this question of culture. The operating system of your company, if you want. How do I create a lean startup culture? So we developed a tool together with a guy called Dave Gray, who's an entrepreneur, created a great company called Explain, and now is an author, and works at Explain again. We tried to figure out how could we help companies intentionally design organizational culture? And the reason why this was so important to us is because in large companies, where I spend quite a bit of my time, we see this phenomena quite a lot. The Kodak moment. So none of us wants a Kodak moment anymore. And I'll tell you why. Because Kodak was actually a very innovative company. They helped invent the first digital camera. So the problem was not having innovation going on. They did technology R&D. They came up with some great stuff, but it didn't prevent them from going bankrupt. So the question is, why did this happen? Why did this happen? What was the problem there? And to frame this a little bit before we get deeper into how to design intentionally a culture, think of this. If you think of some of the greatest companies, yesterday we saw GE, how much money do they spend on R&D, research and development? Big sums, a lot of money. But then the second question is interesting. How much of that money, or time and energy, goes into figuring out the right value proposition or the right business model? Bringing this to the market the right way. And what you'll learn, and I see some of you nodding your heads, what you'll learn is the classic R&D is just not enough anymore. We need to put in place this lean startup culture to find great value propositions and great business models. And it's not either or, it's and. Because, as you've seen, you can go bankrupt with the product that sells, the digital camera. It didn't work, wasn't enough for Kodak. So, I'll show you a little video to frame this challenge inside existing companies, and a bit later on I'll bring this topic of culture back also to startups. So let's watch a little video to understand why it's so difficult for existing companies, in particular large ones like GE, to transform the way they're working.
Thinking about business models in existing companies is slightly different than in a startup. The best way to look at it is by drawing a continuum between improving existing businesses that a company has, inventing new businesses that a company plans to build. On the left-hand side, you have one or several existing business models. The company knows them well, and the entire organization is trimmed to execute and incrementally improve them. Here, the company operates in a known environment with existing customers and a good understanding of the market. In such a known environment, it is possible to make relatively accurate forecasts about sales and predictions about growth. Hence, the left-hand side is all about executing and improving known business models or improving them incrementally. On the right-hand side, you have one or several new business models that the company is trying to develop. The models are far from proven, and the organization is still experimenting with them. Contrary to the improve end of the continuum, inventing is usually done in an unknown environment. Predictions such as sales forecasts or growth numbers are practically impossible to make at the early stages. The company is still developing a good market understanding, hence the right-hand side is all about the search for business models that work. The rules of the game are almost totally different on the opposite ends of the continuum. For existing business models and their improvement, you make business plans with performance projections. You evaluate people on how they meet those projections. Failure is not an option. When it comes to new business models, detailed plans are worthless. Projections don't make sense for yet unproven business models. What you really want to do is perform many small experiments to test the hypotheses of your unproven business model. You will learn from these continuous small bets, which will allow you to improve, adapt, or pivot your business model until you've made sure it will really work. Existing and new business models require completely different thinking, different rules, and different organizational structures to succeed. Are you able to play both games in parallel?
Basically what this is about in existing companies is what academics call an ambidextrous organization that can execute in an excellent way, G would call this the execution engine, and that can reinvent themselves and create new growth engines at the same time. So this is, on the left-hand side, is what the startup culture that you even have to create in a startup, which doesn't always exist, but that needs to coexist with the execution engine on the right-hand side. And that's a challenge to do. But if you can put that into place, you can work in a totally different way. And I believe that the companies that can't do this will become disposable companies because they will go down the same road as Kodak, Nokia, BlackBerry, etc. It's just the beginning of large companies going bankrupt. And you'll see that in the pharmaceutical industry, you'll see that everywhere. So I want you to discuss just for a minute with your seat neighbor, what actually does this word culture, corporate culture, culture in your organization mean? What is organizational culture? So discuss for a minute, what's organizational culture? What does it consist of? With your seat neighbor in groups of two, okay? Let's go, 1 minute. What is organizational culture? Okay. Okay, let's continue together. Let's continue together. Shh. Okay, wow, I have some authority here. That's amazing. Okay, so pretty difficult question, right? I mean, what is it? What is organizational culture? When you ask this question around the world, this is what you get. It's not quite clear, right? There's no shared language here. Is the Tower of Babel? Some of you might know this biblical story, right? People wanted to build a tower that goes to heaven. God came down, created languages. We were just not talking the same language. We couldn't kind of build this anymore. When it comes to organizational culture, strategy, all these big topics, we have a similar phenomena. But I think culture is too important to not start tackling it. In particular today, where companies are being disrupted and need to change. So Dave says, if you want to understand a culture, you need to map it. Okay, well, pretty difficult if we don't have a shared language. Could we create one? So I'll give you a quick definition, and then we'll go into the mapping. So I'll take something very simple. Culture is the value, beliefs, and behaviors practiced in an organization. Is that enough? Maybe we should look at another piece here, which is culture emerges because certain behaviors are rewarded or punished. So let's add that little piece to our definition, okay? So we added here, Culture formed over time because they are rewarded or punished. This could be formal, things like rules, incentive systems. Could be informal because the boss rewards certain things or doesn't, okay? Now, we still haven't figured out how to map this. So let's take this idea, the definition, and try to make a map, try to make a simple tool so we can have a better shared language and a better conversation. So we did this with Dave. So Strategizer partnered up with Dave Gray. We came up with this one first. He did the groundwork, and we said, that's too complicated, let's pivot this. So we actually did Lean Startup for conceptual development. We came up with something like this, the iceberg thing, that's not good enough. Let's make it simpler. And then we came up with this. And it's so simple that I'm almost embarrassed to talk about it. But the good news is, it works, and it's extremely powerful, and I'll go through it now. It helps you have a better conversation around this fuzzy topic of organizational culture, and what it allows you to do is to intentionally design a culture. So the first block here, simply asking yourself, what are the behaviors that we have in our company, our team today? So how do people act? So the questions we'll ask ourselves is, what do people say? What are the patterns of behavior? So you get a group together, they put up sticky notes, and they describe what the culture is. Now, we want to create a lean startup culture. So what are the sticky notes we put up there? What kind of behavior do we want? We want people to act on evidence, not opinion. We want people to test before they execute. We want to start with cheap experiments before we do the huge market studies. We want to test problems before we test solutions. Then we might go on more to management issues. We want management to reward experiments. We want people to celebrate failure. We want a collaboration, if we're in an existing company, between the execution engine and the innovation engine. And then we also want people to start choosing this as a career path. Because today, going into innovation is career suicide. But it shouldn't be like that. And the companies that will succeed will actually make this a real career path, because otherwise they're going to become disposable companies. So that's the behavior. The next step is, okay, why do we want that behavior? Why do we want this lean startup culture? We're going to look at the outcomes, the results at the top. So the question is, what happens because of the behavior that we just mapped out? It could be positive or negative. What are the things that emerge because we have that type of culture, that type of behavior? And when we're talking about lean startup culture, we do this because we want certain things to happen. We want to reduce the risk of innovation. Same for a startup or a large company. We want higher return on R&D, more an issue for large companies. But at the end of the day, we want to build new growth engines. A startup or a startup within a company. And then we have other issues like retention of talent. And in the middle, a bit more management focused. We want to have a company that's designed for the future so we don't become a disposable company. So that's pretty straightforward. But where it gets really interesting, where the tool starts to have power because it facilitates the conversation, is the shift that we want to provoke. What drivers, what enablers and blockers lead to that behavior and those outcomes? And that's where the challenge is. We need to design new enablers and eliminate some of the blockers because they will prevent us from building this lean startup culture. So we'll have questions like, what causes that behavior to happen? What leads to those outcomes? What are those things that will make it easier to develop that behavior that is blocking this behavior? So talking about lean startup culture, it's pretty difficult to put this into place, to create this mind shift that Erez was talking about in existing companies. Why? Because we have these blockers at the bottom. We still write business plans. Who of you has ever written a business plan? Who spent more than a week doing that? You wasted your time because you spend time on refining something that you're going to throw away. So using something more agile. The processes in companies, we use the execution processes that are linear for the search of business models and value propositions. Should be a lot more agile. And then we might have a lack of knowledge and training. Then failure. Which company today rewards failure? Very few. Now, of course, you should punish a $500 million failure, but you should reward a $10,000 failure. Not happening enough today. And the incentive structures are geared towards execution. So we have all these blockers. So this right-hand side, how do we create a culture that allows us to invent, today is not really there in most companies. Some are getting there. I think GE with FastWorks did the first steps. I think they still have some way to go, but they got started. Every company will have this kind of dual structure, and maybe we'll have, beside the CEO, a chief corporate entrepreneur or a chief entrepreneur on the right-hand side. So we have this tool now. I gave you the blockers. The question is, what kind of enablers do we need to put in place at the bottom layer there in our enablers and blockers to really make this happen, to create this mind shift? Because just by believing in it, it's not going to happen. Just by putting up values, it's not going to happen. We need to design these enablers down here. And a friend of mine, Paul Kenny, said, oh, so when you create a new culture, you're basically wireframing it. I really like that expression because we're designing a new culture, we're making a prototype, and we could actually test it. We could apply lean startup to our organizational culture. So basically the idea is we're going from an as-is culture, where we map out the existing culture we have, and then we start designing or wireframing a to-be culture, the kind of lean startup culture we want to create besides the execution engine in an existing company, or the kind of startup culture we want to create in our emerging company, okay? So let's look at that right-hand side and ask ourselves, what are the enablers? Basically 3 areas. First one is leadership, the second one is culture and processes, and the third one has to do with organizational design, the systems you put in place. So I'll give you just a couple of hints. You obviously have to figure out the details that work for your specific company, but in leadership we'll have things like leadership support. Surprisingly, in most companies, top leadership support exists, but the middle management support does not exist. And I see some people violently agreeing, okay? Then we have things like resource allocation. Are we giving this new type of R&D enough money? And here's the biggest one. Even if you have leadership support and you have the resource allocation, the power, the legitimacy of doing this doesn't exist. So there's a lot of innovation theater going on, as Steve Blank likes to say, in companies, because they don't have the power of really making this happening in a large way. So that's why I would say, you know, wouldn't it be cool if we had a chief entrepreneur in every large company who has just as much power as the CEO? That would probably make a difference. Then in terms of culture and processes, we need to have these lean startup champions, and I think GE was talking about this a little bit. That could be starting small all the way to business lines until you transform the entire corporate culture. But then there's smaller things like rituals, celebrating failure and learning all the time, creating rituals, that's going to make a difference. And then obviously the more formal stuff like agile processes. And then the last piece here, organizational design. Something as simple as skills development. People don't know the tools, the processes, and then the mindset of lean startup in many of the organizations around the world. And I think Eric was really pointing that out yesterday really well. You know, here we have believers, but the world is big, and there are a lot of companies to transform. So we need to develop these skills. Then we need to build better reward systems that incentivize quick experimentation, learning, taking risks, small bets to do that. And then the last one, this is particularly important, doesn't exist today. We always see the innovation people as pirates. They shouldn't be, they're partners. And the pirates see the execution engine, those who run the business, as old farts. But you know what? They actually finance them. So it should be a partnership where they work together, because otherwise they're just a startup in chains that has to compete against really agile startups, and a lot of you here will be disrupting some of these large companies. So I'll finish with 3 things that you can immediately do to start designing culture in your organization, lean startup culture or any other desired culture. 10 minutes, just take some time, individually map the culture you have today. If you're the CEO of a company, a team leader, map it out. If you have a bit more time, 60 minutes, gather your team, put up a poster and have this conversation. Because it's the conversation that's going to be interesting, that the tool facilitates, that's going to get you a step further. And then, of course, if you have more time, let's say half a day, then you want to really work from the as-is culture to a to-be culture to start transforming your organization and creating this mind shift that we heard about this morning. So, just in time, thanks a lot for your attention. So I hope you got a little bit out of this. Thanks.